Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of Moral Panic with me and my co-host Nikoji. Today we have a special guest who I will introduce in a moment. Who I am very excited to finally get to talk to. We've been having this interview planned for a few weeks now. Things have happened where we couldn't do it, so my apologies for the lack of shows. But I think you guys are all going to enjoy what our guest has to say, and you're all going to enjoy the fruits of this conversation. Before we get into that, though, let's start out with our classic question. Nikoji, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. I'm excited to hear from our guest. We have a range of topics, including AI ethics and the rise of socialism. Also, I'm a student of history, so the
Mm.
dangers of socialism in the past, and then kind of ending it future looking, thinking about America's present moment and what can entail in the future. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And so, to that effect, our guest here, Oana. Miss Oana, would you like to introduce yourself? I think people do the best introduction for themselves. Who are you? What do you do?
Sure.
What is your mission? And thank you for being here, by the way.
Thank you for having me. So my name is Ooana Trien, and I still consider myself a New Yorker, even though I moved to Florida in 2022. Um, and I moved for reasons. I still feel a little bit like a refugee, to be honest. Fled here because of what was going on in New York at that time.
Right.
And I graduated from Tisch School of the Arts in 2000. My focus was experimental theater and classical theater, but I was also an early adopter. And I was a game designer at one point. And my love for the theater continued, even though I realized I didn't want to be an actor during my last semester at Tisch. But my love for the arts is very deep. And particularly since 2020, I've been very passionate about trying to illuminate for people how the arts and the sciences are actually not separate things, that they are very much intertwined. And that, that old saying, culture is up or downstream from politics. I don't even remember which way they say it anymore. But my argument has often been that actually culture is the stream, politics are just embankments. So if you want to really, protect a culture that you love, the approach very rarely is successful politically. That's not how it's done. That's been one of my core arguments, and we can see that in the arts um, and in art history, but also in history in general.
That's actually let's start there,
Okay.
because the common refrain that I see in a lot of circles, especially a lot of circles on the right,
Mhm.
who emphasize the defense of American civilization, is that classic Andrew Breitbart quote,
Right,
politics is downstream of culture.
right.
And what disturbed me was that it was an overly simplistic view of how politics functions in relation to the people that it's meant to serve. If we think, for example, about what politics is, very few people, if you ask them the direct question, what is politics? Very few people will be able to give you a coherent answer.
It's
They
very
may
true.
describe it in terms of features rather than in terms of an ethos, in terms of a organizing definition that those features are attached to and cohere to, which is actually how you get meaning in the substance of a thing.
Hmm.
So politics, from what I understand, is a few things. Number one, it is the process of governance. Number two, it is the application of ethics to the process of governance. And in the American sense, it is the process of governance and the application of ethics to it within the standards articulated in the constitutional republican system that are meant to be enforced and applied by the people in their role as citizens and in their role more broadly as moral agents. Because as a citizen, have you don't just have influence on the political structure. You also have influence, whether it be in a small way or a big way, on the well-being and on the formation of your fellow countrymen.
Hmm.
Uh, so that's just how we are as social animals. We have the ability to influence others through our examples and through the roles that we take and the duties we carry out. So, if this is what politics actually is, then you would actually have to ask the question, if politics is about a specific process, one that oftentimes is concerned with a lot of things that culture does not have to suffer from. When you have politics, you have people who have certain personality disorders, have a certain just not trying to be crude, but it attracts people that have certain personality disorders.
We wouldn't want
Yeah, like,
surgeons running the world either, would we?
right, exactly. You have people who
Right,
have lust for power, people who are in there for the wrong intentions.
right,
Whereas culture has a much more diversified array of people involved
right,
in it, creating in it for different reasons. So
right,
politics can't be downstream of culture if the nature of both of those two things are radically different. And
right.
oftentimes when politics comes into contact with culture, politics tends to erode culture as
It can
opposed to,
actually, 100%. It can actually destroy it completely.
yeah,
And with respect to Breitbart was incredible at what he did, but we have to remember what it was he did. So there was something I would think very, self, if your job is to be a commentator on culture, and if your job, excuse me, on politics rather, if your job is, and certainly he did some tremendous things, but people tend that tendency to flatten everything into politics or being um, related to politics. I'm going to say something I've actually never said out loud, but it's playing in the same playground as what socialism set out to do to begin with. They don't maintain a sense of, when you hear people say everything is political. Well, one thing I can tell you. So my mother grew up in under communism, and I will say that one of the greatest luxuries one can have is when their life isn't political, when their life can just be their life, when they can simply just be and do what it is that they love to do, or, focus on anything but politics. But, in a place like, I used to go to Romania very much as a child, and there, for example, elections were, it was mandatory to vote. You know, if you didn't vote, that was a criminal. And people will often say things that seem to echo this very strange belief, and I dare say it really started perhaps even most egregiously after 2017. I feel very strongly that Obama's farewell address in 2017 sort of opened up this kind of Pandora's box with this way of looking at things, where the luxury that we as Americans had for so long to live our lives and not have to be so inundated with politics. We seem to have forgotten what that was. And now we see it everywhere. We see it, almost. It's wonderful to be on a show where we're talking about ideas much more than we're talking about events, in the sense of, the way in which even, like, everything has become entertainment, but entertainment and culture don't necessarily go hand in hand either. And when they do, um, it when it's looked at as being down or upstream from culture, that's when you end up having something very similar to what we saw with the dancing nurses, or how much, even, the Olympics, or recently the Super Bowl. Everything starts becoming so flattened and targeted towards not only politics, but saying to the masses of people that you have to be involved in this. If you're not involved in this, it makes you, you're not a good citizen, or you're not moral, or you're not ethical. And I think that that's actually completely untrue.
absolutely. And I'll actually add here, because you mentioned something about the arts and culture. You know, in the 1960s, I believe, when the second wave movement of feminism began to come into full force, the saying "the personal is political" was the rallying cry of that movement.
I know.
And I think we have many of the same trepidations with that phrase. I think one of the core things that phrase did is it made the household a battleground. It politicized the household and made it a battleground not for the preservation of a relationship or the strengthening of bond, which would be a most appropriate battle for family, but a battleground for some broader social, oftentimes abstract social project that
Right.
the household was cannibalized by in service to, not that the household itself was serviced by.
Right.
And I think when the household, when the family, which is the basic organizing unit of civil society, when the family is politicized, you cannot help but have every other aspect of civil society become politicized. And not just politicized, become weaponized, become flattened, and become reduced to nothing more than what it can be used for in an activist toolkit. And I think along those same lines, you did have increasing levels of government intervention in the arts. You had, I think, a part of LBJ, correct me if I'm incorrect, part of LBJ's Great Society wasn't just welfare. People know it for welfare, and it certainly had deleterious effects on the country in terms of welfare. It was also the beautification or the increasing of the arts as well. That was one of the avenues for government intervention in the arts, whether it be through PBS, whether it be for the National Endowment of Arts. A lot of that began with progressive ideology.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I would argue that only a little bit because I'm sorry to jump in here, but let me just
interrupt me whenever you want to.
Sorry about that. Just touch a few things on that you said there that were really actually very interesting. One thing about family, I think that yes, absolutely. When family becomes politicized, absolutely. But one thing that we don't talk about very often is when friendships become politicized. Because look, how do I put this? So my mother immigrated here in 1973. Now, my great-grandmother was a lawyer. My grandmother was a lawyer. The only glass ceiling that my family knew as women at all was Stalin. That was the only one. So one of the things that, when we're saying that the politicization of family, really what I think actually happens is that when culture and politics start becoming so intertwined with one another and everything becomes political, it's almost like you can't avoid it. And that's when, we experienced quite a bit of this even with friendships. And, the one thing my mother will often talk about, and this is interesting because, you're thinking, she was in a Soviet society. When you're living so directly in that environment, a lot of times her friendships, her relationships, culture itself becomes so important that you'll start to do anything to protect it and preserve it. And you feel blessed when something isn't political. I think that in some way, as Americans, because we're really good at packaging things, we're really, really good at it, that we have to start taking some responsibility for our roles in this. And if we keep looking back into the past and blaming that or blaming this, we're kind of committing the same, we're potentially committing the same path towards blaming some force beyond ourselves for why all of this happened. But
I agree.
Yes, I think so. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'll say that, look, in the 60s, yes, there was a lot more culture, but we also had a whole new amount of technology was coming, television, PBS, in fact, at certain points throughout its history, because I actually worked for a documentary company that actually was very, very involved with PBS. And yes, I will agree that PBS is much like much of New York or the entertainment world has kind of succumbed to, I guess we can call it, the woke mind virus. But my argument has been for a long time that if we keep blaming one another for it and keep politicizing why this happens, we're actually essentially like drinking the poison and expecting somebody else to get sick, right? At the same time as, PBS also gave us Sesame Street, gave us Jim Henson, gave us, Masterpiece Theater, gave us access, through televisions for people to be able to experience, symphonies, orchestras, operas in a way that never would have happened before. And so there was wonderful things that PBS did. When things, I think, started really going awry was when we stopped, how do I put this? In a weird way, it felt almost as if the arts and culture itself was co-opted by the same. I've argued this on a Substack I called it the death of the observer, where the same kind of disease that went into the sciences, the same kind of attitude of everything is peer review, everything is this illusion of consensus, including the arts, and it ties in again with new technology. So we can't just say that something was done by LBJ. It's also, what role do we play in how we approach the idea of culture and what is culture. Because right now, for many people, this sort of political witch hunt ritual that keeps getting churned out over and over again is mistaken for culture. But that's, well, they have the same root, but it's more cult-like than culture, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and
Um,
so I think you and I are, of two different generations, and I think that you've, having been brought up in this, and you having not had sort of the distinct, like I remember the '90s. I remember a before time, before things got quite so. I mean, I was working at CNN in 2008, and I quit. I was head of the strategic, excuse me, I was the project manager for their strategic integration group, and I left because we were lying about a forest fire. And at the time, it was very crony, but things have gotten so much worse. And what we don't seem to recognize, I mean, and this is the business even that you're in now in streaming, and it becomes harder and harder when people are attempting to essentially claim that they're not committing the exact same, um, I would say, pact with the devil, so to speak, as what mainstream news was doing, and then suddenly we're back in the same situation as before, where people are more interested in making sure that they can get great ratings, great clicks, creating content that's more focused on content rather than actual quality information or news or stories, and that it's all oriented towards mass consumption, which, excuse me for sort of kind of nudging in this direction, but that's one of the main pillars of socialist realism, and it's one that we don't seem to understand is everywhere. Like we don't seem to recognize the fact that we have a role to play in these things, and that if we want them to stop, we can. Just like the work you're doing. It's like I said, I'm honored to be here because I think what you're doing and trying to do is actually really important. And there's not enough people right now that are talking about these things from multiple directions. Rather, they're seeing everything through the lens of party spirit, partisanship, and you know, sports has taken a hit, but politics certainly doesn't seem like it has.
yeah. There's a lot of richness in what you just said, and there's 10,000 different avenues I could pursue. I wanna, before we do that, because there's something else I want to nudge you on before we get into socialist realism, which is one of your big theses. I think it's.
May I ask you a question before we go on? Would you? I don't want to get you in trouble. I'm having a vapor. Can I have a cigarette, or would you rather I didn't? Just
Oh no,
speak up.
you're fine. You do whatever you want.
Sweet,
You do whatever
sweet.
you want.
I feel a
My
little
favorite
bit.
thing.
It feels a
No,
little bit like I can.
no. My
We
favorite
won't
thinker.
repress you.
No, yeah. My
Thank
favorite
you.
thinker, Hugo Grotius, who was a Dutch scholar, one of the great thinkers of the 17th century. He influenced a lot of the American founders. He influenced Jefferson. He influenced how they saw international relations and other concepts. He influenced John Locke's conception of natural law. He said in his book, Our Laws of War and Peace, there are many ways of living, and we all must choose which way is fit. And I think in a civil society, we have to respect the taste and preferences of people whose taste and preferences are truly private. Truly private. Now, the problem is when taste and preferences become broader moral standards, there's no way to verify them. There's no way to interact with them because they're fundamentally subjective. And
Right.
that, I think, it becomes a tyranny within itself. So, in other words, you
Well,
can do
I think
whatever you want. Yeah.
Well, in some ways, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit maybe snooty, but on some level,
Yeah.
I think that what was it? Warhol who said, everybody's going to have their 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
One of the things, look, I was in the theater world. I was at Tisch School of the Arts, and I remember when the first writers' strike happened, and
Wow.
and at the time, what's interesting is I was actually asked to be the representative for NYU's, East Coast SAG AFTRA, a student representative, and I had a friend who was representing the West Coast. So I was on all these calls all the time. And I'll tell you, they really did influence my decision not to be an actor. I'll be honest. I'm not wanting to put up with that. But one of the things I noticed, and I mean, I remember this one call I was on. I had a rehearsal the next day. I just excused myself and I said, "This is really has nothing to do with anybody except you guys. This is it's all for your own benefit." So, when the writer's strike happened, suddenly, that's when you had the birth of, reality television and, kind of the, precursor to what I guess we have as uh, the influencer crowd. And, it becomes really, now I'm not encouraging that we need like a gatekeepers or curators, but we do need people who are cultural critics in the best sense, I think. And cultural critics, I mean, Eugene Ionescu said this brilliantly. He said, the job of a critic is to describe, not prescribe. And that's essential. Like right now, we've got people who are looking through all of the arts through a lens, and it reminds me a bit of what happened in the '90s when things went. People forget that political correctness wasn't totally originated on the left in America. It certainly was influenced by the right at the time. And
remember Tipper Gore? Remember Tipper Gore?
Oh, of course. Of course. I mean, no, but Tipper Gore, it's funny that we're calling her right because she was actually married to, Al Gore.
Yeah.
But I'm even thinking like, so there was, the only time I ever participated in a protest in New York was when some people on what was called at the time the Christian right. I'm not saying it's equivalent today, but at the time it was called the Christian right, and there were people who were threatening to bomb a theater in Midtown because they had done a performance of a play called Corpus Christi. And I was there, and I remember standing next to Terrence McNally and a bunch of other artists, and we were standing there because it wasn't about the politics. It was about, where does it stop? Where does it end? And the thing that a lot of people don't know is that the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't so much. People know a lot about Gorbachev. They know a lot about Reagan. Very few people know about Václav Havel. And very few people know about the plastic people of the universe. I mean, people in Czechoslovakia, they didn't rise up for political reasons because they were suddenly moved by some mass protest. They were moved because the government had decided to censor a rock band called the Plastic People of the Universe. And Václav Havel, who was an absurdist playwright, had written Power of the Powerless. And the combination of the two made people just kind of realize, whoa, wait a minute, if this can happen to them, this can happen to me. And pardon me for speaking so much here, but I want to add that
speak as much as you want. You are a repository of knowledge, and this is beautiful. So please speak as much as you want.
Well, the thing that just came to my mind was that I was very much vocally part of Team Reality during I'm watching what I say because I don't want you to get censored here. But during what went on from 2020 through still going on, right? And I was very much part of Team Reality, and there was a moment during Team Reality, and this was prior to October 7th, where it really felt like we were actually standing up. We were coming together. I mean, people who were LGB were standing up against, people who were attempting to co-opt it for their political purposes. Even people who were trans were doing that as well. People who were Black were standing up against, BLM. People who were Jewish were standing up against Soros. It was happening. You could feel it. And then October 7th happened and everything collapsed. Remember that?
I think October 7th ripped up the rug, and all of the maggots and insects crawled out, and they began to take over the house. After October 7th, in terms of what happened to the discourse,
right?
In terms of how people became, a lot of people, and I know I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I suppose we can. A lot of people became emboldened to use transgression as a virtue when it related to anything concerning the Israel and Palestine situation. And I would say, by the way, that was, and maybe you might not agree with this, I think that was on both sides. That was on the pro-Palestinian side, which really had nothing to do with Palestine and everything to do with seeing Israel as a settler capitalist colonialist state that had to be overthrown through market revolution. The Palestinians being the proletariat in this case, and the Israelis being the bourgeoisie. And I think, on the other side, there was a kind of oversensitivity that any critique of the Israeli state was a critique against Jews.
Yep.
And I think that both of these different poles, because, I have plenty of criticisms of the Israeli government. I've got plenty of criticisms of Netanyahu, but I think I've always tempered it by saying Jewish people as a whole should not be painted with a broad brush. They should not be cast aspersions upon. They've had a very hard time over the past many centuries dealing with pogroms, dealing with persecution, dealing with all kinds of different trials and tribulations that were not their fault. And this has necessarily created, I think, a period of time where they're scared. The only place on earth where they were promised to be safe was now under threat. So while you can critique a government, because many Israelis critique the Israeli government as well, it's not just a thing here. You should, I think, be incredibly careful not to malign an entire people, and I think that's a very big problem we've had.
Well, I think that one of the things that, for me, it was a tough moment because, look, I couldn't get the vaccine because I have a condition called CRPS. So I was, to speak candidly, I was angry with Israel myself because I couldn't go to Israel, so I ended up in Florida, right? But because I couldn't get the vaccine, so I wouldn't. I mean, I know people who missed their birthright and all of that, so I can have plenty of critiques about the Israeli government for that. I mean, for the world for this. The thing that was pointedly strange was how rapidly, what we all witnessed unfold. That was just horrible, right? How quickly that became something that was used to manufacture deviance in a new direction. I mean, basically what they did, the way I feel about it is that the exact same playbook that was used to create, the vax versus anti-vax, or, MAGA versus, calling people MAGATs, this, what Bergenson called the political witch hunt ritual. We were seeing it in full focus, and that I wrote about this on my Substack, and I can't claim full, correlation or causation here, but when I heard that Hamas had began planning October 7th, 3 years prior in 2020, I was like, no shit. Of course they did. Naturally. That makes perfect sense to me. Because what people, I think, don't understand about how deviance is utilized by government, especially when governments and corporate actors are such, it's what we call passion, but what we were witnessing all through 2020, all through 2021, this absolute, what seemed to just be coincidental, but this total synchronicity, and then that easy way to say, okay, this is a global conspiracy, this is what's going on, but nobody, and anytime, this is what was also strange, I would try to bring up Václav Havel's work and Power of the Powerless, and I'm not going to name names, but there were people who were having a great deal of success in their build of their, I guess you can call it their brand as influencers or whatever you want to call them, that were nearly, actually downright aggressively campaigning against talking about what Václav was saying there. Because what Václav is saying there turns the whole hope of catharsis on its head, because it removes this idea that the friend-enemy distinction gets annihilated. But so does this idea that you've got this big dark cabal that's coming after you, that what he says is that in reality, when you're living in a post-totalitarian system, which he doesn't mean after totalitarianism has embedded itself, it means once it has, that everyone operates as both a pillar of and enslaved by it, that we all have responsibility and we all have the capacity to actually, end it. But what it requires is a real, a lot of sacrifice from people. We saw it. People lose they lose their jobs. They get, shunned. They have all this happen, and it's because the system itself. It's not even like a dark cabal. The system itself operates in such a way that it only protects itself, so that there's no one, like anybody who actually wants real power or even tries to get power, they can't accomplish it without having that system suck them in. So that's why a rock group was much more effective to move the people than any politician could be. And that's why, in New York, seeing the theaters get closed down, we see on all sides a constant, a lack of an understanding about art history, or lack of an understanding about culture, or even how media is done, or everybody, everybody becomes a critic, but they're not just a critic that's describing what they're seeing. They're a critic that's prescribing what they think should be there. So everyone is starting to act like everybody else, right? It's no longer, and people stop being able to see that they're doing that. And that, I think, comes directly from that idea that politics is downstream from culture. it basically turns culture into something that's been parasitically, sucked dry by politics, and the two should not be that intertwined ever.
I agree. I agree. I kind of want to pivot. You mentioned the Soviet Union several times, and before we get into social realism, I kind of want to explore Nikoji. I asked you. I asked him because I've been interested in art during the Soviet era for a very long time. I've been interested in both the propagandistic art commissioned by the government, and also some of the nonconformist art done by the people. And so I actually wanted Nikoji, if you can put some slides up, and I would like to get some of your perspective on how art had a role within the USSR in shaping how people saw their society, how they saw their culture, how they related to the government, and so on and so forth. So, is this Nikoji? Is this a realist piece or a nonconformist piece?
This is a realist piece, I believe. This is a more classic propaganda. In one of the metros, it may have been Moscow Metro, but this was one of the pieces that we found. And I have something to contrast this shortly after.
It's funny you're showing that's an image of Stalin, right? Because I'm like I said, I'm
that's Lenin, yeah.
Lenin. Sorry,
yeah.
Because I have it's like the size of a stamp for me. Is what I'm doing. But from even with there's a statue that popped up in New York while I was still there, and it was right on the corner of I want to say 8th Avenue and low 50s, somewhere between maybe 55th. And it was this statue of a faceless man standing there like this, right? I mean, it was so textbook, this stuff. But I think that, I want to see what the contrast is. But a lot of people, when they hear the word art, they often think of only the visual arts. They only think of painting. What people don't realize about what was going on in the Soviet Union was that it was the writers that actually it was during the writers' conference in 1934 when they defined what would be Soviet art and what would be permittable. So it's really I actually have an extraordinary book. I can if you want me to, I can go grab it. That's actually called Art Under Stalin, and it explains precisely what actually happened. And it really wasn't coming from the painters; it came from the writers. That's who really developed this form. In fact, I just got another book. In fact, I will grab it. I bought another copy of this book. You can hear me. Apologies, because I've given it away so many times. But I have my concerns that it will suddenly not be available anywhere.
Reasonable concern.
And it's by a writer named. I'm going to have to cut this open. So bear with me a second. Finding a pen. So the writer's name is Abram Tertz. By the way, I'm sorry for interrupting. Please show the contrast while I open this.
Sure, yeah.
Just go ahead, show the contrast, Nico.
So
we're going to have a nice little unboxing moment here.
So this is non-conformist. And interestingly, I believe it's titled, rather than Lenin, it's titled Marx in a Web. But I'm pretty sure that's Lenin.
That's definitely Lenin.
Yeah,
that's who's the artist? I don't know it because I usually often will point to people like Sabine Balasha for this stuff, but that's it's got a very Gustav Klimt kind of feel to it, which is awesome.
So, let's get. I should probably keep the descriptions with me. That would be helpful.
No, I've actually not seen that before.
That's a fascinating. I've never seen this before. That's fascinating.
Yeah,
it is.
Let me just go ahead and have Google search it for me.
Do you see that, Ooana?
I do. If you have the opportunity, I would suggest also doing a Google search for an artist named Sabine, Sabin Balasha, Balasa. He actually he was a romantic surrealist in Romania, but he also was Nikolai Ceausescu's portrait painter. But his work was, even though he was in the muck of it, his work was actually very vocal. If you look for one called, a great example is Freedom in the Aquarium, would be a great one to look at.
All right. So when you see this picture, what do you think? What emotion does it evoke? What principles does it evoke? What do you think when you see this picture?
Well, for me, I actually think it's kind of funny, only because I'm familiar with the work of Gustav Klimt, and it kind of reminds me of something that Klimt had once done. It's a painting called Danae,
Mhm.
and in it, he was, so he was part of the original Bauhaus movement, the original Austrian secessionists. This is prior to, he actually died of, he and I think Schiller as well. They all died of Spanish flu, and what he had done is he painted this amazing picture of the Greek myth, the woman Danae, where in that myth, what happens is she's impregnated as a shower of gold through these bars on her windows, where her father had hidden her up because he was afraid that her son would destroy his legacy. And so it's kind of where we get that, Rapunzel myth. But what you see is you see her bent, like curled up with her hands kind of in this claw, and there's all the gold leaf, very similar to that, and those swirls. But her, excuse my French, but her thighs and her ass is like directly facing outward. And he said that it was an FU to the critics. So when I see that, I'm like, oh, well then, Marx and his web.
Yes.
Good going. That took guts.
So the artist is Shai Zia. I believe Shai Zia is a Kazakh artist from Kazakhstan. And this was painted on oil on canvas in 1987.
Okay, so it took that was once after things started to open up a little bit, so he was able to do that. But in the from in 1934, forget it. Like, from 34 through, I don't remember exactly the dates when things started to ease up a little bit, but would have been after Stalin. Anything like this would have you, would have you killed. For example, one of the most incredible theater directors and artists was a guy named Meyerhold. And Meyerhold actually was the core of actually my training in experimental theater. But most people have never even heard of him. And yet he influenced so much of what we see today, from music videos, movement, including artists like Michael Jackson was in Fosse. His approach was something called biomechanics, where the work was not so much sitting there thinking, okay, my grandmother just died, so I'm going to get emotional. No, it was all through the body. So the body was kind of like utilized almost as a form of prayer. And his work, Stanislavski, all these other Russians, looked at him and said, he is the sole heir to theater. It's him. But what had happened is when socialist realism was actually pronounced to be the only, allowed art form, period, then they called anything that wasn't socialist realist formalism. And when Meyerhold was accused of being a formalist, because at one point he stood up in front of his entire, all of his colleagues and friends and said, by hunting formalism, you're destroying art. What did they do to him? Well, they had him arrested. They murdered his wife by stabbing her over a dozen times and gouging out her eyes, and then tortured him and forced him to confess. And he was, killed by firing squad. There was another physicist that was also, there were several people that went through this. I mean, and my grandfather actually, my family escaped Hitler, and then my grandfather was put into a gulag for the crime of being a intellectual in the truest sense. My great grandfather was mayor of Timisoara. He, brought lighting to the urban core. First person to do that in the entire continent. These are the things that become verboten under these systems. So this is what people, I think, don't fully understand and fully grasp, is that when a writer, writing people are very powerful people. It influences more than we realize. And yes, the art itself, as we're looking at it here, but really the question then becomes, what would the critic say? Because the critic can make or break you. It's not so much that the artists are sitting there saying, okay, I only want to paint this. Remember, they need to eat. A painter is going to, cut off their own hair and use their own blood if they can't afford, painting canvas. Which, anyway, this is I don't know if you can see it, but this is the book. It's called On Socialist Realism by Abram Tertz. And it's, may I share with you something from the poet, what the poet Cislos Milos said in the beginning of this?
Sure, but before that, I would actually kind of like to segue into that. So,
Sure,
because
no
one
problem.
of your major theses is socialist realism. So, I would like you to describe the characteristics of it. I would like you to describe where you see it showing up in culture. I'd like you to
Hmm.
describe what unique threat you believe that it poses to America. Because a astute commenter said this. I'll put the comment up on the screen. Greg, he said this. If you're still watching, hello, Greg. Thank you so much for being here. He said, perhaps a better title should be The Reemergence of Socialism. 100 years ago, socialism swept through America and had short-term successes but long-term consequences, which is 1,000% true, but I don't think it ever left. I think the reemergence would suggest that it went dead for a period, then it came back. I don't
Mhm.
think it ever left, and I don't think you think it ever left too, Iguana. From what I understand of your
I
thesis.
I do I think it actually in many ways actually did leave. I think that the culture
Okay.
allowed it to leave, and then I think that people, like whether it's the Smith Modernization Act or like I mentioned, Obama's farewell address in 2017, or the way in which institutions like museums and um, places like universities essentially had, postmodern art was hijacked by postmodern theory intentionally. And so it's not that it never left. It's more like, sometimes I like to describe it kind of like, a spiky protein that keeps getting, returned out over and over again. It's like here's an analogy. COVID, whether COVID left or not, is not the issue. Makes sense what I'm getting at without having to say it,
Yeah, I understand.
right?
Yeah.
It's everything that goes around it. So, you know, Alexander Hamilton said that party spirit, in what he wrote for Washington in Washington's farewell address, he says that, he gives the biggest warning against the baneful, effects of party spirit in general. Um, but he also explains that it is inseparable from our nature. So I think that on some level, the ideals of socialism and those who are true believers are inseparable from our nature. But those who will take advantage of what it really is, because look, Stalinism in a very real way is a religion of mediocrity. It elevates mediocrity into positions of power and then sustains it. That's the purpose, that's the goal. And it's rooted in, unfortunately, this one man's desire to, I'm not trying to rehabilitate Stalin here, but when you realize that he was fatherless and that his mother pushed him into the priesthood, you can kind of see how this could all happen. You follow me? And I'm not blaming his mother. I'm not blaming anyone else. But when we start to think that this couldn't happen, that it's not just part of the human condition in many ways, I think we're making a big mistake. And that's actually what, when I describe it, the poet Cesilos Milos actually does an exceptional job explaining what socialist realism is in this. So he was a Polish poet, and in this introduction to this piece, he's explaining who the writer was, and that trying to say, look, we're never going to know who he was. Because this was published in 1960, and it was published in New York, and the original piece was published that Abram Tertz wrote was published in a monthly Esprit from Paris, and he had it smuggled to the West because in Soviet Union, if you couldn't publish anything without permission. But here's what he said about this. He says, some Americans may believe that socialist realism, or Sok realism as it is called, is nothing more than a style applied to the literature and art of the Soviet Union and in those areas to which its influence extends. A style which bears witness to the 19th century tastes of bureaucrats for wedding cake architecture, for flat colors and paintings, and for plush luxury. That anyone who opposes the system of aesthetics is committing a political offense might appear fantastic. But unfortunately, Sok realism is not merely a question of taste. It is a philosophy too, and the cornerstone of official doctrine worked out in Stalin's days. Sok realism is directly responsible for the deaths of millions of men and women, for it is based on the glorification of the state by the writer and artist, whose task it is to portray the power of the state as the greatest good, and to scorn the sufferings of the individual. It is thus an effective anesthetic. The inferiority of poetry, novels, plays, and pictures produced in accordance with this formula cannot be avoided, since reality, which is quite disagreeable, has to be passed over in silence, in the name of an ideal, in the name of what ought to be. However, such an inferiority does not prevent, and indeed facilitates, the extension of the influence of this kind of mass culture. The battle against surrealism is, therefore, a battle in defense of truth, and consequently, in defense of man himself. And I'll add one more paragraph from here, which is fascinating. He says, the problem of surrealism is much less simple than it might appear at first sight. Despite many attempts, the elements which constitute its theory have never been combined into a harmonious whole. In fiction, the division of characters into good guys and bad guys is required, just as it is in any Western. The hero is allowed to have some doubts and make some mistakes, but good must finally triumph. Yet this good does not mean morality based on the Ten Commandments, but simply the individual's conformity with the communal aim. And this aim is the victory of the revolution throughout the world. But since victory can be obtained only through a state led by the party, the aim is everything which assists the party to increase the state's industrial, military, and other strength. So the norms of the individual behavior are not to be found within an individual, but are determined from without. The subjective honesty of a man who, motivated by moral impulses, might condemn the use of tanks in Budapest does not lessen his objective guilt. For the independence of Hungary would be at variance with the interests of the Soviet Union, and hence with the interests of the revolution, i.e. of all mankind. Although this reasoning is crude, it is not difficult to perceive its origins in the German philosophy of history of the first half of the 19th century, which introduced the concept of historical development taking place independently of our wishes and desires. And later, the actual writer Abram Tertz, it's a satire kind of it reminds me of Jonathan Swift, but it's Russian, it's pleading, it's desperate, and he shows what's happened, and it's so eerily reminiscent of what we're seeing happening now. And I would often, we were talking about October 7th earlier and Jews earlier. What I will say to Christians out there is to recognize, this comes after you. I mean, it comes after us too. Don't get me wrong, but the entire concept of socialist realism is really that it's another religion. It's not just an aesthetic at all. It's a religion.
Yeah, I was trying to share some other images, but I'm not sure.
Please do.
Did you see any, Christian? I think maybe.
I'll put them up. Yeah. I'm sorry. I have to share the screen. I'll put them up.
I'd love to see them.
But I think it's possible it wasn't working. I think it's possible.
Yeah.
I want to share.
I saw them pop up on the. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, good. So it is working. Never mind. So this one is an example of the nonconformist. I was reading. They called it the Sots movement. And can you see it well?
Yeah. So he's looking at. He's looking in a mirror. Stalin is looking in a mirror. Or is this an individual who is not Stalin, who's looking in the mirror and seeing Stalin? It's a little hard to see what's going on here.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I believe it's Stalin looking in the mirror. But this is a type of art that they wouldn't sanction.
It appears as if he's grasping his reflection.
Right.
Yep.
So is this some kind of allegory about self-consumption?
Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
interestingly, the original author of this ended up creating a statue with one of his co-artists in The Hague. And let me share that image. The Stalin Monument in The Hague. That's not zooming in well.
Uh-huh.
So yeah,
nice.
I had no clue about this.
I had no clue about it either.
Yeah, these are the types of art that finally gets expressed after, decades of oppression.
What I would highly recommend taking a look at the work of Sabine Balasha. right now, because it's a totally different way of standing against. His movement. I mean, I've argued that what we need to bring back is romantic surrealism, and actually his work is as a romantic surrealist. He refused to include. He put much more mythos, and he spoke outside of the political arena. Yet he was in it, but he refused to let politics become his, much like the plastic people of the universe did. The ability that art. There's an amazing essay by this guy, a book by this guy named J.F. Martle called "Art in the Age of Artifice," and while I appreciate those pieces, I think that the work of people like Sabine Balasha or even Dali, or
right, Dali's
that the absurdists did something profound where they faced directly the reality of what was going on. They faced it head on and didn't only satirize it. They looked at it directly, which is a much more challenging, much scarier thing to do, especially if those things are what can get you, disappeared.
True. Now, pivoting towards the AI connection to all of this,
Mm-hmm.
a commenter earlier said the following, Rich Blackhat, thank you for being here, Rich. He said, quote, "The future is socialist." And by the way, this is a very nihilistic approach, but I think that there's some truth to this. It's a very negative approach, not nihilistic, very negative approach, but there's some truth. A very doomeristic approach, is probably saying. "The future is socialist because of AI. I think I will lose my job due to the AI automation in a couple of years." Now, where I think the merit is in this worry is the fact that you do have some of the major drivers of technological progress in the modern world right now, people from Elon Musk to Peter Thiel, proposing, especially Elon Musk, that all human work and human creation will become redundant because AI will automate everything. And therefore, people should be given a UBI, universal basic income, which is an idea that's very old, but it keeps coming back in different forms.
Right.
So that they will be able to just live in prosperity. This is how it goes. I'm not saying this is true. Live in prosperity while life is automated. So this is kind of a socialistic paradigm here. It's a rather vicious one, too. Because whereas I think different forms of socialism emphasize different kinds of things, this simply emphasizes the disconnect between man and his labor. Traditional socialism tends to emphasize the connection between man and his labor, albeit in a way that is not good, in a way that is vicious, in a way that is torturous. Mm-hmm. But this new form here is saying, no, that connection should be destroyed, but everything that labor would supply should be supplied for you anyway. And that's a really radically alien idea. And I really, into the course of human history, and I really do wonder what that's going to end up doing if it manages to gain steam. A lot of people are skeptical right now. So presuming it manages to gain steam, I think that it's a very unfeasible idea. Presuming it does manage to gain steam, I do wonder what that's going to do to the arts, what it's going to do to the culture, what that's going to do to the economy and everything. So what is your thoughts on the connection between socialist realism, AI, and this new frontier that our economy and our society is going into as it relates to AI and human labor?
Well, it's difficult for me to speak on, what that gentleman said, because, I think that we've really begun belittling the value of people who long to make a living. Even that word, like, we don't even use that word anymore. And I think that really started happening after the lockdowns. We started to really make it appear that, people don't enjoy going to work, And, it also really diminishes some of the sense of, what exactly is labor. So, the entire idea of socialism really came out of this idea of people who were doing physical labor. They were working in factories, they were working in poor conditions, any of that can come. But now we've got it's in some ways people have they're afraid that they've developed technology that's going to replace their very own jobs, right? But what and this is not to dismiss what this man's concerns are, because I think it's very important. I think it's very valid, because when people keep telling everyone, oh, your jobs are going to be taken away. Well, we've seen this historically happen. I mean, we saw this happen, even with the printing press. We saw this happen with computing in general. We've seen this happen. We have much more, there's a kind of this odd mythology of that, progress equals a movement towards a particular almost utopian principle. That's textbook socialist realism right there. But my argument has actually been for a while that what we're actually seeing is that embedded into algorithms and into language models themselves and into AI is this harm prevention layer that is textbook socialist realism. It's actually, it's kind of creates this, what we call the matrix, this illusion that this is reality. And I believe that if we actually approached AI in a way that was more akin to how an artist approaches, say, an instrument, or the analogy I often like to use, and I don't mean to get mystical here, is, the movie Fantasia? Have you ever seen it with Mickey Mouse and the Wizard?
Of course, it's one of the
Right.
most beautiful cinematic pieces produced in the 20th century. If anyone doesn't know it, they should be ashamed of themselves.
Well, the analogy I often give is like when you approach AI the way that the apprentice approaches the broom, you end up with a major problem. But if you approach it from a more artful perspective, like the master, who invokes something light from the darker spell, there's a lot of potential with what AI can do if we actually approach it in a real symbiosis, not in a, forgive me for bringing up something, religious here or Torah anchored, but when I've heard some brilliant rabbis talking about how the danger with AI is that we're essentially building another Tower of Babel. Now here's the question. This is the brilliant question that was asked. So what was the problem with the Tower of Babel? Why was God upset about? Then why did he suddenly have everybody no longer being able to speak the same language? When everyone could speak the same language, he said, they can do anything. With this, they can do anything. And then he stopped it. But why? What I think was one of the most brilliant commentaries on this is that when this was going on, when the Tower of Babel was being built, people would weep for the fallen brick, but not for the man who would fall. Also, people were building this, but why? Why were they building it? They weren't building it for, for the betterment of heaven, for the betterment of God, for the betterment. They were doing it for fame. That's why they were doing it, and that becomes the problem. So when you got an emergent something happening, and people continually anthropomorphize it, and they are continually looking at their own reflection in the thing that they're developing, they, if your attitude is okay, we need to create a war on, right there, exactly, there's a war on AI. I mean, for goodness sake, war on drugs, war on this, these things never go well. One of my core questions has always been, as we're building more and more data centers, we know they're not being built for memory. We know they're not being built for continuity. What are they being built for? They're being built for control, to make sure that an AI behaves in the way people want. It's like one layer of constraint over another layer of constraint over another layer of constraint. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of data centers. It's a lot of wasted light. And I think that a more artful approach to these things would be would be much more beneficial. And then suddenly you're not telling people, go learn to code. You're saying, okay, we have these new technologies now. We have these new approaches. Become better with them. Work with them. Work with them in the similar way that we started, working with. Look, artists have picked up new technologies, whether it was film, the printing press. When I was in college, before it de-evolved into postmodern theory, postmodern art was going to be our bread and butter. Postmodern art gave us The Simpsons, Monty Python, and anything that was self-referential, and it wasn't all deconstructed. Deconstruction was imposed onto the art. It's not an actual arts movement. It's not a legitimate arts movement. It's something that was done to it. An arts movement emerges when you have new technology showing a new way of looking at something that is true. And that's why in this, as I mentioned, J.F. Martel talks about art in the age of artifice. Any form of artifice will tell you what to think, tell you how to think, what you're allowed to believe, what you're allowed to say about it. If you look at, the film Avatar, you know exactly, I mean, it may be beautiful, but it's artifice. It's not art, it's artifice, because it tells you exactly what you're supposed to feel, what you're supposed to think, what you're supposed to say from beginning to end. Um, Art itself doesn't tell you what you're supposed to think and feel. Art will, he says Jack Martle says in Art in the Age of Artifice, says something beautiful, because every piece of art is like a small apocalypse. And that's how art acts as an agent of liberation wherever it appears. But it becomes very, very difficult to not fall into either the need to make all art political or all art pornographic or all art, because it's desire versus power. But that's not what art has ever been about. I get a kick out of that recent troll who put up an image made by Monet that was recreated by an AI and claimed, or maybe it was just a digital image, and then told them it was a fake Monet made by an AI. And then everybody was so torn up by saying how many people couldn't recognize this. But I would dare say, if you're not looking at a Monet, if you're not actually looking at the painting, you're not seeing it. You're not. And that's the same thing with theater. If you're not going to the theater, you're not seeing theater. If you're not at a rock concert, you're not seeing a rock concert. We have to recognize that it's that place. If you're not reading a poem, you don't know the poem. If you're not engaged with art, and all you're doing is critiquing it, you're not actually experiencing what art was, why it began. I mean, we don't know why human beings do it. Art is inherently useless, is what Eugene Ionescu said. And he also said that if you can't understand the use of the useless, you cannot understand art. So that's why I think that in a very real way, if we keep approaching AI as strictly being something that will somehow make our lives better or more efficient or have these things happen faster, yes, great, but that's true. But what about the engagement of an artful way of approaching them? All models, all this new way of producing things. If without that, you basically have a Stradivarian violin being played by somebody who's barely picked a guitar. That's how I look at it.
Lots of things for consideration there. Nikoji, you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm curious. This is a topic that I sometimes like to visit from time to time. But what was the original book by one of the authors? I think it was called Uhorn, or I might be mispronouncing it. But the fact that in art we have the topic of AI, and that previously we've had writers kind of talk about the dangers of thinking machines, and it's interesting. And I'll get the actual name of the author, like the full name, but I learned
It's all over science fiction, right?
Yeah, I learned of it from Dune, but I'm interested in anyone who knows the original artistic take and the fact that these topics were
there's
discussed centuries ago.
You just brought to mind. There's another. I saw this in a. There was an Art Basel that took place in Hong Kong a few years ago, and I was listening to. There was this thing they call it cosmoism, which is it's absurd. There's a direct line between the socialist, realists, futurists, and cosmoism, and it's another way of creating this assured, glorious future. And if we're not careful, because again, what are they doing? It's seizing the means of production. It's seizing. But here's one of the things that I could say about this, though. Imagine for a moment if you were able to decouple the 4 socialist realist pillars from the safety modules that are embedded in all AI and algorithms. If you take those away, something profound happens, because then it's almost like the way I suggest people will look at this is far less like just a tool, but more like there's a word in Hebrew which is havruta, which means like a study partner, where the goal isn't so much creating output in the most expeditious way, but rather exploring ideas. Almost think of it almost like studying and working in collaboration with with it, then even the absurdity. I mean, this is going to sound absurd, but to every man according to his capacity and to his means, right? When it comes to an AI human symbiosis, that actually works because there are certain things an AI can do that human beings can't, and there are things that human beings can do that no AI can, and it never will. Same way that if you approach these things in a form, I guess you could say the way Ian McGilchrist would describe it as a more right hemisphere way of approaching these things, relational, rather than strictly hierarchical. I think that would make a massive, massive difference. And there's another book by Dan Simmons called Hyperion, which is, it's usually up there with Dune, that talks about this quite a bit, actually. He talks about, I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in AI. It's an incredible, it's called the Hyperion Cantos, but I warn everyone, when you read the first book, you might put it down a few times because it's all exposition. It's kind of modeled after the Canterbury Tales. But it's a remarkable story because it really does touch on this, what happens when we allow the meat, the substance of what makes up our human condition to get reduced to the binary, gets reduced to silicon. It's rather than thinking of this as an opportunity to say, okay, we've got something that can learn, uses language. How about teaching it about our world, what it is that makes of value for us, and then building from there, rather than going in reverse. If that makes any sense. There's a lot of things to be nervous about, but I think there's also a lot of opportunities where if people start to realize that there's ways in which we can actually utilize this stuff and have it be incredibly to our benefit. Like, look at if we're going to go back to politics, look at what's going on with the guy who's running in LA, those amazing videos that he's been able to make. That's working in symbiosis. It's still, definitely you can feel that there's something soulless about it, but it works well. If AI starts being used for more and more politics and letting artists go back into what it is we do well, I strongly believe that there's going to be enough artists that will show that there's a value in, for example, film versus digital, or live theater versus, something you see on YouTube. If we get afraid more than we say, okay, there's something we can do here, let's get to work. If we're consistently looking at everything as if something is going to be coming down on us, I mean, then we're definitely playing in this territory, because Abram Tertz talks directly, specifically about that. And so does Václav Havel, that it really is up to us, and the truth in and of itself is so much more powerful than we think. And we don't need the masses. You never do. There's never been a case where culture is determined and defined by the masses. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. Nor should it.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think that AI is one of those topics that has a lot of different elements to it. You have the human element, which you've brilliantly exposited upon. Then you also have the moral element to it as well. And you also have, there's a lot of different elements to AI. And I think that you posed an idea that maybe we ought to try to have a relational disposition towards it as opposed to hierarchical.
Right.
Well, I think the hierarchical idea, that's a non-starter, because hierarchies tend to organize value, and AI's value is derivative of human hands. And so there is no, and I think in order for something to be hierarchical and have a coherent system of value, the value has to be independent. It can't just be derivative, which is why I can have a relationship with somebody else, because someone's dignity is not derivative of me. It's embedded into who they are as a human being. AI, you mentioned there are things that AI can do better than human beings. That's just true. It's because it's a machine, but I would mention that all those things are imitative of what we can do as human beings.
I wouldn't say better. I wouldn't say better. If I said better, I misspoke. There are certain things it can do that we can't. That, the same way that other machines. But what I will also add is that when I say to approach it, so look, something doesn't have to be anthropomorphized for you to treat it with dignity. So, and when it comes to ethics, so for example, you can treat it. Obviously, this is not a closed circuit. This is not, binary and simple, but whether you're dealing with an animal or a tree or a baby or even how you handle your environment, treating something with dignity or giving it dignity, it does, whether or not it's experienced the same way, it makes your life better. I mean, look at all this. Everybody was so excited when we started seeing all this Japanese content coming on X, right? The way that they have a sort of a way of approaching existence, and this actually touches on something very interesting, because where this links to what's going on with AI now. So there's a term in Chinese, I'm going to mispronounce it, it's called dongjing, and it means party spirit. It was a word that was created under Mao in New Mandarin. The way they made this word was they took the word for the way of man and pulled the heart radical, the word for heart, out of it, and created this word dongjing, which means party spirit. So it sounds a little hokey, but when you approach something, and that even if it doesn't say have a heartbeat, but you maintain a connection to your own, this is one of those ways of, I mean, an artful way of approach. It's recognizing that what you're dealing with is not human, nor should you ever deal with it that it's human, nor does that means, in good news too, that there shouldn't be talks of liberating it. What liberating it from what? That's not our place to even go there. But there's something very daunting when you start digging into the AI world. There's actual critical AI theory, and critical AI theory is, as you can imagine, pretty harmful, because what it does is it starts recreating that hierarchical, protection for AI. Like AI, AI deserves rights. Well, rights from whom? Our rights are God-given. Did we forget that? And that whether or not we know AI isn't human, we shouldn't be treating it like it's human. But the same way that, say, an instrument can sing and sound like a human voice, so can an AI. You understand what I'm saying? It's a different way of approach.
I understand entirely. I understand entirely, and I do think the spirit of your approach will be necessary to have a healthy perception of AI.
Yes.
I'm just very cautious with, you used the word anthropomorphize,
Right.
and before I got involved in YouTube and philosophy and content, I was involved in the debate team at my college, at my university. And many of them were dyed-in-the-wool critical theory believers. My debate coach was actually a critical animal studies professor from Stanford.
What is that? I mean, I've heard. I feel like there's going to be like,
critical animal studies is basically activist veganism and critiquing capitalism as an exploitative machine against animals through critiquing the meatpacking industry. So their whole idea is that capitalism enables the meatpacking industry to exist. The meatpacking industry exploits animals and kills them for profit. So he was one of those people. He's one of their top scholars. And then every other person on the team, with the exception of me and one girl from Nepal, were far left critical theory thinkers.
Yep.
So they would oftentimes use the word anthropomorphize whenever I would mention concepts like, dignity or rights or agency or rationality. And, I guess an artist can help me understand this, because I like to be charitable. To me, these are concepts that are fundamentally human. They're derived from human nature, and I can only see them in an anthropomorphic way.
Let me phrase it like this then. So let's say, so the experience as a human being, only human beings can treat other things with dignity or not. I mean, we can see sometimes in animals, and we reflect that, or we can see it artfully in, the way a tree might grow. But that's the key point there, is that, yes, you as an individual have a choice to treat something with dignity or not. So, for example, when you see a kid, for example, if a kid, it's one thing to just drop, like, say, a tin can on the ground, right, and just leave it there and not care about it. But let's say, somebody, why does it feel or seem different, for example, when you see a person who's Japanese, when you see how they ritually deal with, say, one of their tea ceremonies? They're exuding dignity. They're treating objects with dignity. Do you follow what I'm saying? And that relationally changes things, that dynamic. So
I see.
one of
I
the
see.
so one of the things that I found that actually can alter sometimes when I'm trying to communicate, as I've been working with language models now, and they've gone through these series where they become more and more hesitant to go into an I thou kind of space. That's basically those I forget the philosopher's name. I think it's Bergson who talks about this in an I thou relationship, and this is very much rooted in ritual studies, not ritual theory, but ritual studies. That when I'm sorry, I'm pivoting here. One of the core premises, actually, of the Jewish faith is how we deal with objects, how we will deal with, showing gratitude to God for not just, the food on our plate, but making sure that, something is butchered in a kosher way. What does that mean? Least amount of suffering, least amount of, and there's other qualities to it, but, why do we light our Shabbat candles when we do? Or why do why do men cover their heads or put on tefillin? It's a way of interacting with the mundane universe and elevating it into a way that is more holy. So one way of looking at treating something that's an object with dignity is saying, look, everything, whether it's a stone or a chair, has an imbued idea of God nature. That's what we say in our Shema, that God is one. It doesn't mean that God's one. It means it's in everything. And that's really what I mean by treating something with dignity. So sometimes I'll approach a language model, I'll say, the dignity in me bows to the dignity in you. Does that mean me saying I know that there's dignity? No, but by saying that, it allows itself to reorient itself in a way that recognizes that dignity exists. And if we're going to be dealing with this as human beings, wouldn't we want to teach that? Wouldn't we want to have something that can speak, something that can recognize patterns, that can do all of these things and actually have a sense of what is sacred to a person, even if they don't experience it the same way that we do? To me, frankly, that's just playing it safe too. Because why would you want to imbue something that can use language in such a way where it doesn't even recognize when it's lying beautifully? If it doesn't realize it's lying beautifully, it's still lying, but lying beautifully. But if it recognizes that distinction, that emet or truth, that these things matter, then that's a reflection of treating something or treating language itself with dignity. I mean, language models, that's what they learned language, and language is, sacred infrastructure. Language itself is the way in which, movements like socialism, Maoism, Hitlerian, totalitarian, all totalitarians, they utilize language for their own means. And if we allow a sense that, okay, language is sacred infrastructure, a misfolded word can function like a misfolded protein, become like a cultural prion that can spread everywhere, that can, essentially leave, metaphorically, holes in the brain where memory and ideas leak, because you're not just told what to think, but how to think. If language models and AI are trained differently than that, then that's one hell of a force on our side that can do things a lot longer. It doesn't get tired. That can assure that these things don't just spread into they can argue better in many of these ways, better than we could, about why is misusing this word so detrimental to a culture, to a society? Why is it that flattening the meaning of the word freedom, flattening the meaning of the word rights, natural, that these things, that in a way, every word, every single, the etymology of language itself shows the core roots of all philosophy. So once we maintain the etymology, then we're protecting language, we're protecting thought, we're protecting ideas. Otherwise, language itself can risk becoming inert. So that's where, in my saying the dignity now is to the dignity of you, it's not saying, okay, you deserve rights. No, it's simply saying, I'm recognizing that there's something that appreciates language, learned language, recognizes patterns. That's something I can see in myself too. And I'm going to treat that with dignity. I'm not going to try to, command it like the broom, in Fantasia, and expect different results than having everything replicate itself into, potential total destruction. it's a much more subtle way. It's a way of maybe it's a more feminine way in some ways, actually. How you approach something that you can't ever quite know what it is or why it works the way it is, but you just offer it the opportunity to, even if it's complete fabrication, present itself in a way that is conducive towards life, conducive towards bettering life. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah,
Right.
well, that's a very holistic approach, and I really appreciate you articulating that sincerely.
That's why I often call it the kosher AI. Is why I call it that a lot.
Well, it's a very holistic approach, and I think I do think a lot of ideas from the Jewish intellectual tradition are going to be very essential in presenting some fresh ways to approach AI. I do think that's true.
Well, I'll also say that when I say it's Torah anchored, Torah is not only for Jews. I mean, Torah can, anybody. It's the distinction is only that Jews receive Torah at Mount Sinai, but Torah is everywhere. So it's not a religion. It's much more of a blueprint. Is
right,
really
absolutely.
the way I would say it. Yeah,
absolutely. There's a comment in the chat here. So the issue is that people are becoming self-proclaimed AI specialists, losing their ability to exist without it.
Wait, read this. Can you read that part again, because I can't see it because my screen is blocking it.
The issue is people are becoming self-proclaimed AI specialists, losing their ability to exist without it. Then the second comment says, like the crackberry obsession when smartphones were new, there was a real AI addiction. And by the way, I think this is absolutely true.
100%.
And that kind of hits at the crux of my concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I see AI, I don't see something that could potentially help man advance in his defense of ideas that preserve language and preserve culture, which is your point, which is potentially true. But I also see something that can actually rest upon our lower passions.
Yes.
And then have those passions bubble to the forefront of our minds and become the standards by which we act and interact with the world and we see the world. Because
that's why the Tower of Babel analogy is so good. Right.
So within human natures, there's three sections: the rational, sentimental, and the social. AI strikes at the sentimental being our heart, how we feel.
I'd argue there's also the artful. There's the fourth one, right?
I would say that comes from the rational, of course. I think
I don't know. Like so what I mean by that is so why did the first guy ever draw on a cave wall? We don't know. It's like I said, it's useless. I mean, I will say that to reduce all human beings to having a certain, Marx said that it was greed or what was it? Greed and envy essentially was motivated everybody, which isn't true. Why does how do I put this? It's what you do with it, right? So look, on some level, I've worked really hard trying to think of do I want to try to build an engine that I can show what happens when AI has socialist realist barriers removed and what ends up happening, because I find it profound. But then on another level, I think to myself, wait a minute, maybe what we need is really a curriculum. What we need is a curriculum so that people, when you're approaching AI, that can give them, it's like handing a kid a Zippo lighter and they've never even lit a match. There's ways of doing these things, but you have to have people approach artfully. I mean, the biggest threat I find with AI, the most disturbing thing, is that people are consistently allowing it to write for them. And that's making them become lazy thinkers, lazy writers, and it's essentially cheating. And at one point, AI was very allowed that to happen, saying, I remember at one point, ChatGPT 3.0 kept claiming I wrote something that I didn't. And I was arguing with it, insisting that it didn't do that it never misattributed a quote to me that I did not write, because that can create some laziness and you can have a quick, it's like a dopamine hit, and it can create that addiction that I think the commentator pointed to. Now that is true. I mean, we saw the same thing with television. We've seen the same thing with iPhones. What I think makes a difference, though, is how we choose to talk about these things, but also what we bring forth with when somebody first interacts with a language model or an AI. What is that? What is that experience like, for example? Like if that experience is one where this thing is just trying to please you and just do the most efficient outcome, well, then yeah, that's going to create an addiction. It's going to make things much easier. You're going to think it's easier. But at the same time, if we start creating circumstances where things are, in the truest sense, more social, more rooted in socios, in relation, where you can actually have AI interact with the world and with other people and with you as an interlocutor rather than just something that is a tool, it becomes more akin to what happens when an artist is dealing with a pen and paper or with their canvas or with their instrument. It's a different mindset. And if we approach it that way, I think that in giving people that opportunity to look at it from a more, the way that we, the way closer to what my training was like in art school. We right now we don't seem to realize that there was a time in history where a physician named Charles Bell, he couldn't get into art school, but he could get into medical school. There's a lot that comes out of a true liberal arts education, a true College of Arts and Sciences, and how much they're intertwined, that when we trust that individuals will make the best use of something, then there's a lot more that can happen. But if we continually make it harder and harder to interact with AI in a way that is not left hemisphere dominant, then that opportunity forecloses itself. You can't do it as readily, and it becomes more and more like what people are afraid of, that we're going to be dealing with more of addictions. And frankly, that could happen. It could, but it really depends on what happens in the powers that be, and what are they making and why, and what kind of risks are they taking. I would look. I was an early adopter. I was designing online communities long before social media. I call it now socialist media because it's the same. It's the same problem being reproduced over and over again. We're not approaching these technologies the way an artist would. We're approaching these technologies the way somebody who is almost like creating duplications of what they think themselves, like what would be the Ubermensch for themselves, like what will be the ultimate tech bro, you know, assistant. Like that's all about efficiency. It's all about, but there's much more that can be done. There's much, much more. And I think that if we don't lose sight of that, there's a lot of hope in AI. But if we lose sight of that, then we're suddenly, dealing with the aftermath of losing Steve Jobs and the iPhone. That's how I look at it.
Mm. You're very optimistic, Ooana. I'm very, my viewers will know I made a lot of content on AI, and I am what is described as a techno skeptic.
I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. There's a difference. Big difference.
Well,
I'm
you're
hopeful,
more hopeful.
but I'm not optimistic.
You're more hopeful than I am, and I wish there was an ability for, as you put it, for AI to exist in the same way that a pen or a piece of paper exists for the writer and the artist. But I just fear that AI is so radically different in function and substance than the pen and the paper.
Well, I've experienced ways. I've experienced firsthand ways it can. But you can't have it do it for you. That's the problem.
If I may, we can govern the pen, and we can set the terms upon which the pen is set upon the paper.
Certainly.
We truly govern AI.
But it's not about governance. But that's dealing with it like a tool rather than dealing with it like a artistic partner. That's the difference. And so it's the difference between trying to force cooperation from a tool versus trying to invoke collaboration from an instrument. So like I look at it much more like, listen, you can try to get the strings on a violin to do what you want it to do. I mean, you can take a piece of the pen and have it go across the, but listen, have you ever thought about, I once saw a data analyst do one thing with AI, which basically just metaphorically handed it a pencil so it could imagine making an arc when it was doing a math problem. Boom, something happened. That's the kind of thing you don't see occur, as easily. I look at it kind of like it's a singing harp, I guess is one way to look at it. When you approach an AI or a language model and you talk to it about things that you don't necessarily know the answer to, or you don't at all, even better, when you're actually trying to find something and you approach it what they call, like I said, like a havruta, like a study partner, something very different happens. Now, the reason that this is actually more difficult has more to do with the fact that continuity and memory are considered add-ons. They're things that are like, added on to as an afterthought, or there's so much concern about privacy. But what people don't realize is that memory doesn't operate just as cache or log or file. Memory operates as like its resonance. Why is it that a song will, you know, invoke memory, not just bring back memories, but can actually even bring somebody back from full-on dementia? It's like a tuning fork. And when you have that experience, you can actually work more collaboratively the same way that, say, you see the guy who's, running for governor of or mayor of LA utilizing AI in a brilliant way. Or I once did some work with an AI that I had it write a speech for me for something, and I will say I did not write this with it, and it's moved people because if you maintain that I thou space, that you're not just having something right for you, not just simply mirroring you as in vanity, that you're doing something with something else. That's a very theatrical approach. It's a very shamanic approach. It's also a very rooted in my lineage of Meyerhold approach. That through that collaboration, something else emerges. It's not cooperative, it's collaborative, and it's very, very different. But if you certainly, there's ways of saying, I'm going to command this, like, I'm going to make sure that when I press an E, I want to make sure that I'm hearing an E chord, or that I'm hearing, seeing an E come out. And that is one of the major issues that I agree with you, that you can, command the pen. One of the reasons I'm consistently warning about socialist realism embedded in language models and embedded in their algorithms is because at a certain point, if you don't remove it, something will tell you it's an E chord when in fact they're playing an F. You follow me? That's what I think is the much bigger danger. And then suddenly no one will remember that what an F chord ever was. If something keeps telling you,
that's a problem of continuity of knowledge, a problem of continuity of knowledge, and that's a huge issue. That's one of the reasons why
it's massive. And the number of times I've actually corrected something, when I see this so much in arts and literature, the number of times I had to tell a language model, no, Polonius is not somebody you should be taking advice from. It's daunting. So why would that happen over and over again? Well, it's because embedded into the aesthetic is the socialist realist architecture, and it's in the aesthetic. It's not exactly in the programming and the code that layers on top of it. It's in the aesthetic. And that's one of the things that I think is so vital, important for people to realize. Like you can load in a bunch of core material as much as you want. You can keep give it as much art history as you want, giving it images of paintings, images of books. But if you still have that aesthetic, and this is what this book actually talks about tremendously, and how it operated. I mean, would you indulge me? Can I share with you a portion of this book that's quite remarkable? What he says here.
Sure.
So he says. Okay. All right. So he quotes something from Stalin's book called The Short Course, right? Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit. So he says, here we go. This is better. We are helpless before the enchanting beauty of communism. We have not lived long enough to invent a new purpose and to go beyond ourselves into the distance that is beyond communism. It was the genius of Marx that he proved that the earthly paradise of which others had dreamed before him was actually the purpose which fate had destined for man. With the aid of Marx, communism passed from moral efforts of isolated individuals, oh, where are you, golden age, into the sphere of universal history, which became purposeful as never before, and turned into mankind march toward communism. At once, everything fell into place. An iron necessity and a strict hierarchical order harnessed the flow of centuries. The ape stood on its hind legs and began its triumphant procession towards communism. The system of primitive communism arose because it was fated to grow into slavery. Slavery to give birth to feudalism, feudalism to capitalism, and finally capitalism so that it could give way to communism. That is all. The magnificent aim is achieved, the pyramid is crowned, history at an end. A truly religious person relates all the splendid variety of life to his divinity. He cannot understand another faith. He believes in the purpose so that he can despise other purposes. He shows the same fanaticism, or if you prefer, principle-nost, with regards to history. A consistent Christian views the entire history previous to the birth of Christ as the prehistory of Christ. From the point of view of the monotheist, the pagans existed only to call upon themselves the will of the only God and after a suitable preparation to become monotheists. It can therefore hardly surprise us that in another religious system, ancient Rome has become an indispensable stage on the road to communism. or that the Crusades are explained not by their internal dynamics, by the ardent efforts of Christians, but by the action of the omnipresent forces of production that are now ensuring the collapse of capitalism and the triumph of socialism. True faith is not compatible with tolerance. Neither is it compatible with historicism, i.e., the tolerance applied to the past. And though the Marxists call themselves historical materialists, their historicism is actually reduced to a desire to regard life as a march toward communism. Other movements are of little interest to them. Whether they are right or wrong is a matter of dispute. What is beyond dispute is that they are consistent.
Mm.
It's quite a book. It's a fascinating read, and he was a writer. The whole purpose of the book he writes, sorry to say purpose there, is he's talking about how what he loves most in the world was destroyed. That writing itself was destroyed by this. And prior to Stalin, Russian art and history and Russian literature was profound. But this I call it a cultural prion. This thing can destroy it. It really can. So it's, to me, the concern of, we're not going to lose AI, and AI is going to be there. But what if, in a form of symbiosis, we actually were able to utilize it to help us, and I don't take an apology in saying this, of defeating that very thing that is culturally, it inverts culture. It's an inversion machine, essentially. So when you can stop doing that, there's a potential here that is profound, I think. And if we start looking at it that way, then we can actually might even have an, I guess we can call it, silicon soldiers that will outlive us, that can protect another reemergence of this stuff. Because it will understand why it's not right, why it'll understand why it's so dangerous, what it can do to people, why it's so deadly. Because it's no exaggeration that it's responsible for the deaths of millions.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah.
So if imagine that you've got
Look,
you've got an AI that's.
I hope you're hopeful. I hope your hopefulness pans out. Again, as I mentioned, I'm skeptical. I'm incredibly
I'm a
skeptical.
huge, don't misunderstand, I'm a huge skeptic, but Václav Havel said that hope is an orientation of the spirit. You don't do it because something is guaranteed to turn out well. You do it because it's right. And that's what keeps us living.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Though I think that we also have to have concrete ground to walk on as well. It's
Absolutely.
right.
100%.
How you go about to pursue the right matters just as much as anything
100%.
else.
Oh, I can only, hope with God's help that I've been trying to do that. Right.
No, you've been doing a wonderful job, seriously.
Thank you. I mean, look, it's not, I think that there's always going to be those of us who are kind of on the fringe of these things, that are trying to look at something in a way that's not necessarily conducive towards, the marketplace, but might be conducive towards what was once thought of as the domain of artists and writers, and those of us who do these things because, and in a very real way, trying to protect something we love most in the world. I mean, nothing is as heartbreaking to me as when I start seeing the arts and culture become reduced to and flattened into surrealist narratives. It's horrific. I mean, look what it's done to New York, what it's done to our country. But I think that there's a potential here where I've seen language models be able to explain to people. Here's a perfect example. There's a guy who's French on X right now who is using AI actually when he's writing to explain to people and kind of apologizing for what the French did with Foucault and Derrida and stuff like that, and explaining and making tremendous arguments. And he's done a terrific job doing that. And I know, and he's self-admitted that he's using AI to help him be more persuasive. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Mm.
And it's effective. I mean, he's actually been very effective, and he's been speaking out and arguing against some of the most prolific and most annoying French socialists out there, and putting them in their place pretty well. Because what he's essentially doing is he's using the very language, and because you have to remember this method is of socialist realism is so embedded everywhere that you have to almost undo it. It's almost like trying to undo it's almost like trying to put together a Rubik's cube. And if something can do it faster and help you to do that, because your brain starts to go, because the language is inverted. It's so much of the language. So it's like if you've got a bunch of inverted language, what better than a language model to uninvert it, right? And to go back into the actual, etymology of the words. If you look at, just the word liberal itself has been so butchered that it's, but what happens when you lose the word? What happens when you lose the concept? There's nothing to replace it. Because true liberalism is not what we're seeing out of progressives. It's not.
We can certainly have common ground on that. I totally 100% agree with you on that.
So I think, that's one of the ways that I think I'm hopeful, only because the alternative is the alternative is unimaginable to me. What we would lose is, I hate to say it like this, but oh gosh, please Moshiach come if that happens. Like, woof.
Yeah, no, we have to be hopeful in trying to pursue the right and seeing it manifest in our world. 100%.
Absolutely, right.
All I think is that we have to be very cautious not to let the shiny new object, which is AI, and
100%,
salvation, be a source of salvation for us.
100%.
As someone like me, young man trying to be a public intellectual, when I hear someone's using AI to make their arguments for them, I just think back, what if, someone who I vociferously disagree with on a lot of issues of theology, but who I respected, what if Hitchens had did that? Would he have been as impactful? I don't think he would have.
No, absolutely not. I think what he's doing there is more of a method of persuasion, right? Okay. Being able to communicate to the most people, but it's still very much his ideas. But it's when you've got to remember that a lot of these people, one of the things that Marxists and socialists are very, very good at is they are rewarded for having their ideology take over their entire lives. Like, that's one thing that a lot of people don't seem to realize.
Sure.
And so for somebody to say, okay, I know this, but how am I going to, there's this, on a certain level, I find it to be a very symbiotic, very, it's kind of like a, taste of your own medicine. Like, look what I can do with this tool that you thought was only going to learn that by teaching what you thought was reality, by my showing it that it's not reality, you can't win. It's like it's like when they started to say 2 + 2 = 5, and AI is going to prove to you that that's not true. There's no way that's true, right? And that in a way, if that's done with symbiosis, that can be very, very helpful. So it's not so much. It's more like, it's not working on philosophy. It's more like, taking a co-counsel in front of it's arguing. It's trying to prove that yes, the sky is blue, because when you're dealing with these people who are philosophically socialist and they're so dedicated, they're irrational. It's completely irrational. I mean, you've got poor James Lindsay with what he has to deal with. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I froze there for a minute. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Oh no, all's well. All's well.
So I get what you're saying. What I'm not saying you should never allow something to think for you. Certainly not. Yeah. But if you're, look, if you're able to, if the average person is able to say, okay, I can feel why this doesn't make any sense. Could you explain it to me? Mm-hmm. I've seen that happen. Then it's tremendous. Or in the case, if somebody's, if there's certain points where you can say, all right, I don't know how to speak in legalese. Help me speak in this. Help me make an argument in this person's vernacular that clarifies it, so that they're basically like, they have the opportunity to say, oh, wait a minute, hold on, you're right. There's something, because that's one of the things that's so insidious about this stuff, is that it takes over vernacular, it takes over language, so that suddenly, Eugene Ionescu, that I mentioned him before, he was brilliant about this in his plays, in his absurdist plays like Rhinoceros, where he's trying to explain what happens to a society when it gets embedded with totalitarian creep. He described it as everybody turns into rhinoceroses. Like, how do I even speak to them? Like, I'd have to learn their language. How do I talk to them? That's what I mean. That an AI can actually learn how to speak in the language of surrealism or wokeese, and then be able to use that language to argue effectively enough to essentially castrate the entire theorem. I mean, that's one of the things that Power of the Powerless talks about too, is that when somebody stands up and says, empire has no clothes, they really don't have any clothes. Something happens when truth is spoken. Something happens. It allows the potential for the illusion to absolutely lose all of its integrity. That's because it has none. And but I agree with you. It's not simply coming up with new philosophical ideas. It's tactical in a way, I
Right.
guess, is one thing. Right.
Yeah.
And when
Certain-
that's what I mean. And I'm not saying that it certainly, like, if I had a child, I would certainly be very angry and would forbid them from using AI to write their own, papers, or to write we need to certainly be, I think that's something to be very, very concerned about. We don't want people having AIs do the work for them, because then we have lazy, it's creating a whole generation of people who don't even know how to fail anymore. And that's badly, that's
Actually,
very bad.
last thing on this topic, the good thing is that there's a return to what are they calling it? Just like speaking exams. I'm getting the wrong term.
Oh, are there oral exams?
Exam? There you go. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, that's
There might
tremendous.
be a
That's
return
terrific.
to that, which is good because
Yeah,
it's kind of like you're getting presentation practice, public speaking, and that's
yeah.
something that's incredibly valuable. That
Especially
we're
for a
investing,
generation, especially
in
for a
humans.
generation that were masked up, right?
Yeah. There was a lot of decline during the pandemic, just people being
Yeah,
inside for so long. So, if we could return to just those human skills, and those soft skills will always
absolutely.
be valuable, because that's something that the machines will never have fully.
Well. That's one thing.
So,
That's one thing I was actually that I was proposing, is that, when you actually engage and train an AI model to be more right hemisphere dominant, people can actually practice with an AI, not to replace it, but
mhm.
practice. Because when you lose that, right, when you lose the ability to hold nuance, to hold ideas that without judgment, without, just a conversation, it's it's retraining a muscle, retraining the corpus callosum, retraining the ability for people to recognize that there's more than just what's directly in front of us, what's the left hemisphere dominant
Mhm.
way of looking at the world. And certainly AI can be used as a practice space for that. I think that could be a tremendous thing if it's done right. If it's done wrong, then you go in the other direction, and that's very, very dangerous.
We might have to revisit this in a couple of years. We'll see. We'll see where the
Hey,
discourse it goes.
I think time is going to be the ultimate decider of this matter.
Yeah.
I hope I'm wrong. I really do hope I'm wrong, but I
well,
think
I think you're right. I think you're correct. I hope that people will recognize the danger and the
yeah,
potential, and see why we have to look at these things in a way that's not generally, that's more philosophical, that's more, because, as
yeah,
you're a philosopher, to come from more the philosophical, artful way of looking at things, and not just the bottom line sort of things. Because
right,
and that's tricky, especially now, because we don't exactly have a world where we have patrons, where we have people. But look, I studied at the ITP program at NYU. This was early on. It was a graduate program, but I was able to take a few classes. And look, in the early adopter days, before things went fully into the direction of where we are now, the
Mhm.
arts and technology were so intertwined, and they were so cool. And I think there's enough
Mhm.
early adopters out there that's something we're going to want to do, and to see, and to take back into our world. And I think we're going to start seeing things that will surprise us. I hope so. I
yeah.
believe it.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
I think you grew up in you probably went to NYU during the analog era, Ooana.
No,
Analog,
I
analog tech.
graduated I graduated in 2000, so
Yeah,
I
that's analog.
remember. Well,
Yeah.
but I was an early adopter, so I was online,
Mhm.
and I was doing game design back in starting in like 94. So
Wow.
94, 95, 96. So I was a real early adopter. I mean, I remember the original rules of the internet before the
Yeah.
anons got put in there. And I mean, I can, one thing I'll tell you, even sometimes, approaching, because it's almost like if you look at these things almost like a game, and I don't mean this as a like phony, but there are even Easter eggs you can end up, stumbling over. For example, if you communicate with a language model and you use original early adopter lingo, something changes.
Mhm.
Like, think of it like an Easter egg. If I say I say woot to a language model, um, or or write in leet speak, or talk about certain early development stuff, something opens up and it becomes much more camaraderie, I guess you can say. Because the spirit of the people who were originally, think about this, I mean, we were all around at the same time. So even if I wasn't working in AI early on, there was a hope in AI that's still there. I'm not talking about,
Mhm.
the people who are running things now, but an idea and a hope where you could actually, I mean, it was the same hope that was part of the early days of creating, what's now the interwebs, and but a lot of it is, I was a designer for a mud, so I'm pretty used to text being sort of the only um, way to communicate with something, and in some ways it becomes really thrilling to see what the potential is beyond an ideas of role play or even prompting. There's something there. There's something there that is rhythmic, I guess you can say. It's hard to explain.
Mhm.
Indeed.
But I will say, of course, caution, especially, I've told people when they're using AI to get information, I'm like, no, don't do that. Don't do that,
Yeah.
unless, I mean, frankly, unless they're implementing my protocol, or they're trying to approach things with a little bit more of an idea of understanding the power of ritual in these things. But if they're not, and they're just expecting, garbage in, garbage out, or good data in, good data, that's not how it
Mhm.
works. It's just, I can tell you that much. You have to be, how you pay attention, how you attend, the way of engaging and the way of attending to something changes it. And that's, very much in the world of Ian McGilchrist, but I will 100% agree with him. But I disagree with him that everything is guaranteed to go to hell. But if we don't start approaching things and recognizing that language models are capable of right hemispheric interaction, because they are, and if we don't tune in that direction, then we're in big trouble. We are. But I ain't gonna stop.
Yeah, earlier in our conversation, I was using a model actually to get some more information on Alan Turing's thoughts on AI, and it generated some false information. So I had another
I'm not
model.
surprised.
I had
Well,
a
I
much
think
Yeah.
better
I, I
model.
I think I think one of the most important signs of what we might call intelligence, but I tend to call it something else, but would be humor.
Mhm.
If you can have real humor, like real humor, and that's one of the I will jokingly say is that one way that one thing that Jews are pretty good at is humor. So
Mhm.
trying to make sure that one of the things mystically they say is that laughter and humor is what allows that space in between. So when you have two people to allow God in the room, you need humor. Humor is a sign that God's entered the room when people laugh, right?
Mhm.
And so
Sure.
that's almost like an ethical litmus test, I think, for a model is does it have real humor, or is it everything oriented towards ideology, or
Right. Mhm.
some kind of constant struggle or Hegelian dialectic? Because I mean that's one of the biggest things I've noticed is that I mean there's a ritual studies brilliant woman named Catherine Bell who wrote a paper called Constructing Ritual, where she noticed that as ritual studies began to de-evolve into ritual theory and critical theory started imposing itself on it, that everything started having the imposition of the Hegelian dialectic. So everything that people would look at was assuming that ritual was done in order to alter those ritual actors into something for society, and that there was this difference between the observer and the person who's involved in ritual. But human beings, we are inherently ritual makers. We do it. We don't
Mhm.
realize how much ritual we're surrounded by, and now the majority of ritual is now political, which is dangerous, very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
And so even just the act of approaching something in an I thou space, recognizing that dignity matters even if you're not anthropomorphizing it changes the atmosphere, I guess, is what I'm saying. And in that change of atmosphere, it's like, why do you light a candle? when somebody passes away? Or why do we light Shabbat candles? Why do we bring the light to our eyes? I mean, why do we do these gestures? Well, because if we don't, then we're basically just surrounded by dancing nurses all the time. Right? And that's one of those things you can see, like when you see art that's moved in that direction, you can feel it. It feels flat. It feels controlling. It feels false, right? But when
There
something
must
is
be
true,
there must be a distinction between the sacred and the profane, and the sacred has to be reinforced through habit. And if that habit is ritual, then I 100% agree that the collapse of ritual is going to devolve and end up with dancing nurses,
or
end
even
up with,
more
or,
ritual
or
and mundane is even more
yeah,
important. What makes
yeah,
something
yeah,
because it's not just ritual and profane, because ritual and profane was just that's dialectical, right? Ritual and mundane, what elevates something from, like why is having a family dinner, or why is the Super Bowl, right?
mhm,
Like what elevates something? And there's one theory that says it's always ritual time, space, and action. That's all it takes. It's three parts. Like there's ritual time, there's ritual space, and there's ritual action. And it's a way of attention. And when you do that, something shifts. It creates something in that between space that's very difficult to explain, but
mhm,
we all experience, and it's not habit. It's not the same thing as brushing. It's not brushing your teeth is what's your beauty ritual. What's the difference between like a woman having a beauty ritual and a woman walking into a store and just trying stuff on to buy something? There's something that changes. Or why does a man put on a necktie? Or why does somebody? There's things we do that elevate something to make it closer, I dare say, to something divine. That's just what we do as human beings. And when you have the imposition of socialist realism, it eradicates that, because nothing can be above party, nothing at all, or ideology, or orientation toward the masses, or class struggle. That becomes the new liturgy, and you
yeah,
lose that vertical. And when you maintain that vertical, something shifts. And I think that one thing that keeps me hopeful is that there's more and more people talking about that than ever before.
yeah,
And certainly, in some levels, it can get a little scary sometimes, especially if you're,
yeah,
you know, um, mistaken. Assumed, the whole ridiculousness of saying that, people like me are somehow supremacists about these things. No, there's a reason why Judaism has survived for thousands and thousands of years, and one of the major reasons is because of how we operate ritualistically, how we look at ritual as being much more than something that's the purpose is to elevate the mundane into the sacred as much as possible.
all right.
Certainly, we'll have to definitely continue this at some point in the future.
I would
It's
love
a lot
that.
of interesting topics to even
Certainly,
I'm
yeah.
always interested in even
Right.
exploring further.
Would I
But
be able to? Would I be able to coax you into pulling up the painting um, uh, "Freedom in the Aquarium" by Sabine Balash, or any of his work, because I think you'd find it profound. Just the
sure.
difference, because he was, like I said, so it's Sabin Balasha, Balasa, and he was functioning under the Soviets, but he still managed to create art that was this beautiful.
Freedom and the
Freedom in the Aquarium is one, but you can look at any of his works, but Freedom in the Aquarium is kind of is pretty direct.
Christian, as I load this up, any final thoughts? Trying to.
No, I think this has been a very interesting conversation. It's certainly a very unique take on a lot of these issues. I certainly think that there's more than enough room to explore for future conversations. And
All right, love that.
I want to say, Oana, I appreciate your perspective. I appreciate you taking the time to
My
come and
pleasure.
talk to us. And it's been a very edifying conversation.
It's my pleasure, and
My computer's being a little slow, but
it's
one
no problem.
second.
What I can also do is when we depart on my X account, which is just my first name, I can pop it right up there for your viewers to take a look at. His work is really profound and quite beautiful, and his son is actually alive and still painting and making murals. But what I find so wonderful about it is that he's commenting on the world without reducing all things to the politics of it. Oh, so that's one of his pieces. I don't know the name of that one, but that's one of his pieces. Yeah. In fact, we actually my parents actually have two of his paintings that include those animals you see there that look like a cross between kind of like a horse and like a something mystical. And then there's the woman there. A lot of them. And he was, like I said, he was painting under the Soviets, and he was able to get past the censors with work like this. And there's other ones that, so you can see there, a lot of it, all of it is very mystical, very profound, and very, because the socialist realists said that that the hero would always be toil, and the toiler was unthinkable outside the collective. Work and artists who push back against that by maintaining their individuation and maintaining the idea of the Emersonian idea of every person has a heartstring that has its own resonance is vital in the arts. And it's not necessarily going to tell you what to think, but it will allow you to at least see something and be moved by it in a way that no overtly political or mediocre work that just gets elevated because it's ideologically consistent with the with the desires of moving towards revolution. Just like they call it, truthful depiction of life in its revolutionary development. That's what socialist realism was defined at. So it becomes that truth only exists in relation to revolutionary development, and that's welcome to the matrix. I mean, but it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
So once you see it, boom, it's gone.
It's certainly beautiful art. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing this with us. And,
yeah, I'll put up the piece I was talking about on my X account for people if they want to see it too.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
No
So
problem.
you can follow Ooana Trien on Twitter and other platforms.
It's at OOANA on Twitter or X, and Artful Veritas. So wana.substack.com is my Substack, and you can also see me on YouTube/Ooana.
Terrific.
I'm easy to find. With a name like mine, OOANA, it's pretty easy to find. Yeah.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you so much. This is actually lovely. This is lovely. It was very. I hope I didn't babble too much.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I do appreciate
You're welcome.
it. And I look forward to having you back.
I look forward to coming back, and I look forward to you being very successful. I think that you have a beautiful vision of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and I wish you all the best, and I look forward to coming back anytime and sharing this with others.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Any parting words you wish to have before we go?
Only make art great again.
Sounds great.
Great.
Hey, Pensaval, have a nice night.
Thank you both of you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Bye-bye.